Hey there guys, and welcome back. A while back on the show I kind of made an attempt to repair some bandsaw tires for a Ryobi bandsaw that's in my shop, and it didn't go that well. If you don't remember, let's just have a look. Yep, that about sums it up right there. Anyway, I ended up getting the bandsaw tires ordered in. They were on back order. They finally came in, and we're going to replace those tires today. And I thought, what better opportunity than to replace the tires and do a video on a short little bandsaw setup, tune-up, whatever you want to call it. So, without further ado, let's get over to the bandsaw and tune that puppy up. Alright, so what we've got here is the Ryobi 9-inch bandsaw. I believe it's the BS901 is the model number. And I don't know, the price was right. It was given to me, and it's done me fairly well in the shop. So I think it's worth at least replacing the tires on it. Ryobi isn't my favorite brand by any means, but this particular unit has served me rather well. So the first thing we're going to need to do, of course, is replace the tires. And you can see here I've got two new tires. As I said in the video where I tried to repair them, if you're going to replace one, replace them both. I mean, if this one blew because it's brittle and old, the bottom one's going to blow fairly soon as well. So save yourself the hassle and get a pair and replace them both. In this particular instance, I think both belts, taxes in, both tires, taxes in cost me about 20 bucks. So anyway, we're going to start with removing the old tire. Well, the one that's left. The other one removed itself. So the first thing you want to do, of course, is get access to the inside of your saw. But before you do any of this stuff here, and I just sort of caught myself doing this, let's make sure that the tool itself is unplugged. So we'll just unplug it over here, and there we go. And of course, as I have shown you guys before, giving the power switch a flick on and off just to ensure that we have no power there is the best way to go about it. So for this particular one, it's just two little latches and the housing opens up, and we can see here that the blade is still loose from my last little adventure, we'll call it. But the first thing you want to do here is we're going to remove the blade. And in most bandsaws, they'll have a split table in order to get your bandsaw blade out, and they'll have some form of pin here. Now, whether it's, in this case, it's a bolt, or it could be a pin which is on my larger bandsaw, but neither here nor there. We need to get that pin out so that we have a place for the blade to travel in order to get it out of this saw. So with that being done, we're going to carry on now and continue to remove the blade. With this particular unit, the blade is encased in this safety guard, which also doubles as a depth guide or a height guide, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to take a 4mm hex screw here, and we have to loosen off the bolts that hold that blade guard in there. Without that, of course, the blade guard isn't going to come off because it's held in place by this little guard here. You can see it's just held in with these two slots, and they give you that fancy warning there not to stick your fingers in there. But anyway, you want to remove the guard to get your blade out. Now this is only for this particular model, of course. Yours may be different. on how to remove the blade, and I would suggest that you check your owner's manual and see how they suggest it. But it's as easy now that we have that front guard removed as very carefully just pulling your blade out through that front slot, and there it is, the blade is removed, and both of these wheels now have absolutely nothing on it, so we can carry on now. And our next step at this point in time is going to be to remove this old lower tire. We've got the tire here on this lower wheel, and I have no intentions of saving this tire for a spare or for spare parts. I mean, if it's rotted, it's rotted, and I can see there just by giving it a little poke with this screwdriver, I mean, I'm able to break chunks off of it, which tells me that, you know, I'm not gouging a rubber tire here. It's pretty much gone hard and turned itself into a piece of plastic. So with that being said, I'm not even going to be kind with this thing. I'm not even going to be nice about it. I'm just going to cut the tire off. I mean, if I'm not saving it, there's really no point in being gentle with it. So I'm just going to put a cut in it there and hook something underneath here, and I'm just going to pop this tire off, and then we'll have both tires bare, both wheels rather, bare and ready for the new tires. There you go, you can see where I've cut it. And of course from there we'll just peel the tire out. And that's it. Now time for a little bit of cleanup. Well, there's quite a bit of old sawdust, and it's caked on there, and it's caked on the bearings of the wheels here. You can see that. So before I carry on any further, I'm going to use my compressed air and my air hose and just blow this unit out and clean out all of the pulleys here. And but if you're going to do this with compressed air, of course you can do it with an old paintbrush and a vacuum as well, but if you're going to use compressed air, don't forget your dust mask and your safety glasses. Compressed air can eject pieces back into your eyes just as quickly as what you were doing on a table saw or a drill press or what have you. So safety first here, guys, as always, and get your PPE on to protect yourself from this stuff. Well, we've got the saw all blown out, and it's looking nice and clean. There was all of this sawdust and everything that was around the bearings has all been cleaned up, and she's actually looking pretty good. Hopefully from that last video segment you can see why it is that I was telling you to get some dust collection on your face, or a dust mask rather, and some eyewear, because that stuff is flying everywhere. But the next thing I want to do is I want to lubricate moving parts, and I don't really like using wet lubricants in my tools. The sawdust just gums them up. I prefer like a graphite spray, and there's some guys that don't like graphite sprays, but well, that's personal preference, right? So with the graphite spray, you basically want to spray any moving parts. So in this particular case, I'm going to do the bearings, and I'm going to do, of course, this screw tension up here, and a few of the screws here, the lower bearing, and then that should be it pretty much for lubrication. The reason I haven't put on the tires yet is because I want to get this stuff sprayed on first, and that way I'm not blasting it onto a brand new set of tires. So we'll just go ahead now and give it doesn't take much of this stuff, so just a little spray on the moving parts, and you can see here that it really doesn't take much, and it is quite messy, but the stuff is awesome. This is for high heat, which will serve very well for the bearings, and you can just get a little bit into each of one of the bearings, and it will really go a long way to prolonging the life of your saw and its moving parts. And again, up here onto these thumb screws and the moving parts there. So now that we've got that done, now we will go ahead and put on our new tires. Putting new parts on anything can be a bit of a struggle. The old stuff was stretched on there nicely. It was all new, or it was used to being fitted on there. Everything was great, and these ones can be a struggle, no doubt. So we've got our new tire, and all you want to do is sit it in the track and get as much of it sitting in the track as you possibly can. At this point in time now, you're going to need to stretch it around the tire and try to feed it into the grooves of the wheel. And it is a difficult process because it does move, and it doesn't help that I've only got one set of hands. But you just want to very gently now just ease it. Oops. And of course it doesn't help that I'm trying to stay out of the way of the camera either, but anyway, just ease it around the tire, or the wheel, sorry, around the tire, and just get bit by bit into the track of the tire, just like that. And once you get it all in, of course you can push it into place and it will snap down into the groove where it is supposed to be. Now these tires are actually, they're not flat. The top edge around the outside is actually a curved surface, and that aids in tracking the blade. So you can see how that one went on, and now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to put the new bottom tire on. Alright, so the next step in our little adventure here is to put your blade back into your saw. And it's not rocket science here. You just want to reverse the steps that you did when you took it out. So we'll just place it on our top wheel, place it on our lower wheel. You want to make sure that you've got the tension loosened off enough at the top that you can get this blade on without too much hassle. This one here is hooked in the blade guard, so there we go. And just like that, the blade is back on. Now we're not done at this point. Anytime you change your blade, you want to adjust certain pieces of your bandsaw. You want to check for your tracking. You want to adjust your guide blocks, or if you have guide bearings, you want to adjust those. And as well, and in my opinion anyway, one of the most important things that guys quite often neglect is your thrust bearings, top and bottom, which is the bearing that pushes against the back of your blade just to keep it from doing that twist and that crazy maneuver. So at this point in time now that we have our blade back in, before we put our guard back on, we're going to check for all of those things, and we're going to start with the tracking. We've got our blade on, and I talked about the tracking, and I'm just going to apply some tension here to this blade. And what I've done is I've actually put my blade severely off kilter here. And for those of you who don't know how your blade should ride on your tire, it should be centered. And if you look at it here, I've got teeth that are hanging off the edge, and you can see the rubber tire both here and down here at the bottom that are drastically exposed. This is a very poorly aligned blade, and it's only going to cause unnecessary wear on your saw, and it's not a good setup. So if you have this, and sometimes putting a blade on, it will end up like this. If you just spin your blade by hand, just slowly, you should see this. Did you see it just go really crazy out of line here? And then once the blade starts finding its position, it should start tracking. And right there is where it has ended up tracking. And I'll tell you right now, I don't like it. If you look here, we've got way too much rubber exposed, and that should be riding in the center. So for this particular unit now, we have to adjust the tracking of the blade. And there's lots of ways that that is done, and on this particular saw, it's just an adjustment knob at the back of the unit. And I'll see if I can do this without interfering too much with the saw. So it's just, I turn that knob at the back, and we can see it's starting to come a little bit forward now. And then of course we can tune that knob just a little more, and we'll get that blade tracking right in the center. And as I'm looking at that, there, I'm not sure if the angle of the camera is showing it, but that blade is actually tracking beautifully in the center of that tire now. So with that blade tracking like that, we can tighten down our setting and leave it like that, knowing that we're good to go. And this one's kind of nice that it has this little window here that you could check your tracking while the saw is running without having to actually open the housing. So here's the question: if it was set so beautifully before, why was my tracking so drastically off? And the answer, of course, is I pulled the blade off to show you how it should not be, but it should have tracked normally again. The reason it didn't is I've got brand new tires on, and they're not worn, they're new, they're original equipment, so to speak. And of course that changes the geometry of everything. So now we have the tracking set correctly, and we can move on from there. Well, the next thing that we want to adjust is the thrust bearings, and that would be this little guy right here. Most people are used to seeing a bearing with the blade running on it like this so that it can spin, and these ones here actually push up against the back of the blade, and what they do is prevent the blade from being able to push back as you are pushing in with your stock. Now, there's all kinds of theories as to where this should be. Some guys say leave the big gap, some guys say put it butt up tight up against her. You want to get technical, I guess. The gap that I would put between the back of this blade and the thrust bearing is about 15/1000ths of an inch. And if you're wondering what that is, it's a dollar bill. I guess I'm dating myself now. We don't have dollar bills here in Canada anymore. So a dollar bill is basically a 5, a 10, it doesn't matter. It's currency. One thing that you could do to set it up, of course, is you could buy a cheap set of these feeler gauges that I've got here, sort of thing. And these are relatively inexpensive, and you can see that basically you just pull out the size that you want, and once you get that size, in my case it's 15/1000ths, you can place this, if you like, in between your thrust bearing and your blade, and pull it out and tighten her down, and you know that you're good to go. But basically, if you put in a dollar bill or a 5 or whatever, I'm not going to get into the denomination of the bill, but put the bill in behind it and then give it a little tighten. And what you should feel when you have your thrust bearing up against the back of the blade, you should feel a little bit of resistance, but still be able to pull that out with no problems. And then you know your thrust bearing is set correctly. So do that for the top and for the bottom. Another good gauge is when you turn this here won't necessarily spin, but once it gets a load on it, this bearing will then suddenly spin. So 15 1/1000ths on the top, and don't forget to do it on the lower thrust bearing as well. One thing I want to point out with these thrust bearings is some of them are kind of centrifugal, and what I mean by that is that, let me just show you here, if I loosen this off, I can from the back position, do you see that moving there? I can position that so that it's incorrect. This here in this position in the center, all that's going to do is burn a groove through my bearing. So you want to get it over to the side like this so that it will make the bearing spin, and just tighten her down. And then of course I'll have to check it with my feeler gauge again, but if you can see that, see the bearing spinning there? Now that's set up correctly. Alright, so, and we'll check it with the feeler gauge. And again, you should be able to slide this in behind your blade and pull it out. A little bit of resistance, but that's the distance from your blade to your thrust bearing, and that's 15 1/1000ths of an inch. And top and bottom are done. And now we're going to move on to our guide blocks, which this one has. Some of your saws might have guide bearings. So the next thing we want to adjust now is our guide blocks. Some saws have guide bearings, and this one does not. This one has the blocks. So what we want to do here is, let's see if you can see that. You can see the block going in and out, and these are kind of like a cool block, and they help to cool the blade as it's cutting. And of course we have them top and bottom, and it's the same deal with these in that you want about a 15 1/1000ths of an inch gap. Now that's what's recommended, but for my liking, I usually take it down until the guide blocks are just ever so slightly touching the blade, and then I tighten up the guide blocks. Same with the bearings. And pretty much if you measure that with your feeler gauges, you're going to find that you're actually within that 15 1/1000ths in here, and that it runs fairly smoothly. So with that being said, now we're going to adjust these, like I said, just in till they touch the blade, and then tighten them down, and you're going to be looking at about 15 1/1000ths of an inch gap between the blade and the block. We've got the adjustment on our cool blocks here, or our guide blocks, guide bearings, whatever you want to call them. We've got it done as far as in and out on the blade, but how about this way? And you want to make sure that your guide blocks or your bearings are not running on the teeth. That will do some serious damage to both your guide blocks and the kerf of your teeth. In fact, you'll probably destroy your blade. So what you want to do in this instance, of course, is you want to adjust them in or out accordingly. And again, with this one, it's a 4mm hex wrench, and you want it at about the middle of the blade to the point where it's not going to interfere with the teeth. And I'm not sure if you can see that. It's quite difficult to see here, even in looking at it in person, but let's see if I can tilt that camera here, and I apologize for the shakiness, but can we see that there where that is adjusted? It's adjusted right in there, and right there at the base of the screen you can see where I've got that guide block. It's roughly centered where it gives plenty of room for the teeth to still do their job, and that's about the placement you're going to want. At this point in time now that we've got our thrust bearings, our guide bearings or guide blocks adjusted top and bottom, what I'm going to do is, I neglected to do it before, but just a little bit of graphite spray on our thrust bearings just to keep them running smoothly. I'm just going to run this piece of paper here. This graphite spray really does make a mess, so just to keep the spray itself off of my table. So just give that a little shot there and spin that bearing. That should be good. Alright, moving right along. Alright, and now that that is done with the graphite spray on the bearings, and we're going to now replace our factory blade guard on here. And again, that's just a matter of two 4mm hex bolts. They're cap screws actually. So we're just going to put those on there and we're good to go. So that's the setup of the blade. But now, of course, one last thing here. We're going to raise up this blade guard, and what I want to do is I want to check this blade for square. I don't know if you can see that there, but we're a little bit out of square. You can see that we've got a bit of a gap here. Well, we haven't put our screw back into the front plate of our table, so we're going to do that, and I don't expect that that's going to alleviate any of that inconsistencies in the table here. I think this is nothing more than an adjustment issue from where I've been mucking around with it and getting these tires replaced. So with the adjustment at the back, of course, we're going to loosen it off and we're going to bring it up till we can see that she's square, and then we're just going to crank it down, and then we're just going to double check, and that's pretty much it right there. So now we've confirmed that our table is square to the blade, and let's do some test cutting. Some of the big complaints that I've heard over the years about bandsaws have pretty much all been in relation to how the blade tracks. And it's complaint after complaint after complaint of guys that say they can't cut a straight line on this thing because it keeps wanting to wander either left or right. So I'm going to show you a little trick here that will really help you, and for starters you would only do this on a new blade. Once you get it done, you don't have to do it again, and what it requires is a small sharpening stone, and all you want to do is, with the saw running, very carefully bring that stone around just like I'm demonstrating here now. And what that will do is round off the back of your blade to make it so that the sharp corners are not digging in and tracking off site. That's one thing that can help you. Any other tracking problems that you're having, I can almost guarantee you that you have misaligned either your thrust bearings top or bottom, or your guide bearings are misaligned. If all of your guide bearings, both the guide bearings that go with the blade and your thrust bearings, are all aligned and everything's good, I'm going to say you've got a twisted blade and you may want to try a new blade in there. But for now, let me show you how to round off the back of your blade. And that's it as far as rounding off the back of your blade goes. Now, for cutting, a lot of guys will leave your guide way up here. And what that's going to do is it's going to give you a lot of bounce and a lot of play in that blade. So, whatever stock you're cutting, bring your blade guard down to just above your stock. And that is going to help you a great deal in your blade control. There will be a heck of a lot less flex in 1 inch of blade than there would be in 4 inches of blade. So now I'm going to do a test cut. And I've adjusted the blade for this particular piece of wood. And what I've done is I've drawn a straight line down the middle of it. And being that all of the complaints come with blade drift, I'm just going to run it through and cut this straight line and just see how much adjustment I actually have to do. I shouldn't have to be doing this to get a straight line. I should be able to feed that wood through and the blade should be able to track itself in my piece of wood. So let's just try it out now that we've got everything adjusted. Well, hopefully you guys could see in that video I wasn't doing this all the way through trying to track it. It was a straight feed, a straight cut, and it did rather well. That is where a well-adjusted blade really comes into play with a bandsaw. And if you guys are having problems with your bandsaw and the blade tracking, you got to check those thrust bearings and those guide bearings or guide blocks depending on whichever you have. And there you have it. It doesn't really take much to tune up your bandsaw, guys. It's that whole process, of course, should be done every time that you change your blade, but the entire process from front to start, once you get the hang of it, is only about a 3-minute process. Some of the things are already done for you, like the blade tracking should automatically fall into place. Table out of square, you should be checking that anyway. Things like the thrust bearing, that will require adjustment, as will the guide bearings, depending on, or the guide blocks, depending on the size of blade that you put in. Smaller or larger, obviously, that requires some adjustment. But for any of you beginners out there that are looking for a tell-all book on this sort of thing, I've had this one for a lot of years, and there's all kinds of post-its and bookmarks in here, and scribbles and highlights. And what this is the Bandsaw Handbook, and it's authored by Mark Duginski. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But this is a great book. I'll just give you a photo of it right here. I'm sure it's still available on Amazon or, you know, your local bookstore. But guys, this is an awesome reference for anyone out there who really wants to learn the ins and outs of the bandsaw and how to adjust and how to calibrate, etc., etc., etc. Highly recommended. But that's up to you. If all you ever did was books, what the heck would you need my videos for? Guys,
Thanks for watching, and we're going to see you again next week with yet another woodworking video.